The decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire has remained an area with a vast amount of interest and study for centuries, particularly so since the first comprehensive analysis by Edward Gibbon in 1776. The vast majority of these factors can be placed into two schools of thought, which comprise the main historiographical debate. The first group is internal factors, which usually seek to demonstrate inherent flaws or weaknesses in areas of the Roman state. The second is external factors, these being events which occurred in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries which were not contingent on the empire. Gibbon argued that the adoption of Christianity during the reign of Constantine was the most important factor because it eroded the martial and civic spirit of the empire. He famously wrote the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. When studying contemporary sources, it must be remembered that they were produced as a response to particular circumstances. With the benefit of hindsight, it can be tempting to represent these writings as prophecies or foretelling of future events, which leads to unsubstantiated conclusions. The major problem with determining this strength is that it is very difficult to do so without a level of understanding of the empire in this period which does not exist. As a result of a lack of surviving sources, our understanding of the economic and military strength of the empire is extremely limited. Roman historian Vegetius argued that the empire was declining because of a growing barbarization of the army. According to this was a problem because these barbarians were loyal to individual generals and to gold. This increased influence of barbarians diluted Roman culture and led to increased decadence. The widespread inclusion of barbarians into the Roman army and settlement inside the Roman state had been a policy which existed for centuries. This occurred during the height of Rome. For example, Augustus settled 40,000 Suevi. Contemporaries involved in the army such as Ammianus or Procopius never suggest that this was a realistic military problem. Regarding their ability in battle, evidence suggests that barbarian troops were preferred to Roman ones when recruiting for elite units. Regarding their loyalty, it is also wrong to assign any form of ethnic solidarity to ancient Germanic people who regularly fought amongst each other. It is also a mistake to imagine barbarians as being forced into battle against their will. In fact, most of the barbarians recruited to Rome were volunteers attracted by the much improved standard of living and career prospects it offered. While Gibbon shared the view of a barbarization of the army, his primary argument for the decline of Rome's strength was imperial decay. Imperial decay has been described in different ways, but generally it is claimed that Roman society declined in some way. Gibbon attributed much of this to the adoption of Christianity. According to Gibbon, the new religion led to wealthy patrons donating to the church instead of investing in towns. Many capable men neglected their civic duty to instead become part of the clergy. Teachings of Christianity led to an increased pacifism and monastic lifestyle. While this focus on religion has declined, many who argue for Rome's weakness in the 4th century continue to argue for an increase in corruption and decline in civic virtue. This argument is difficult to quantify, but some argue that the increased size of government during the reign of Diocletian caused this. For example, the Senate that was established in Constantinople expanded from 300 members in 357 to 2,000 by 387. Jones noted the great inertia of the civil population during the barbarian invasions. According to this theory, the generations of Romans who lived in the late empire must have been somehow weaker or flawed in some way compared to their great ancestors. However, only anecdotal evidence exists. The idea that previous generations were somehow more noble is common in Roman history and other civilizations. Proponents of economic explanations argue that Diocletian's enlargement of the army made it so large that the taxation required to pay for it bankrupted many landowners. The evidence for this came from contemporary sources of a phenomenon known as the flight of the curials. These were wealthy landowners who served on town councils and were descendants from those who originally built Roman towns. Landowners increasingly began to refuse to serve in their old capacity because of the administrative burden and cost, leading to the argument that the empire had overburdened them. The late empire did see the decline of the power and appeal of local government. In the early imperial period, wealthy men would invest in their town to gain Latin rights and to win influence within it. Diocletian's reforms confiscated much of the funds previously used by local governments and so made them much less appealing to ambitious men. They instead sought a role in the larger imperial government. This has been remarked as a negative transition. In response to this rejection of the traditional arguments of weakness in the late empire, Adrian Goldsworthy proposed that while the empire retained its strength, it fell in 476 largely because of internal divisions. His argument cited the frequency of civil conflict in this period, from 217 CE until 476 CE. There was only a few occasions in which a decade would pass without a civil war. All three of the great emperors of this period, Diocletian, Constantine, and Theodosius, all fought long civil wars. Overall, while the late empire certainly had limitations in its military, economic, and political structures, it does not seem that enough evidence exists to conclude that these led to the empire falling in 476. These limitations had largely existed for centuries, and the Eastern Empire continued with many of these structural limitations after the 5th century and enjoyed prosperity. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia is one of the external explanations. This created a shift in the balance of power, which led to many of the internal changes detailed earlier, such as the expansion of the army and the confiscation of local government funds to pay for it. An inscription in Persepolis details the extent to which the balance of power shifted in the 3rd century. It describes the defeat of Gordian III, the amenity paid by Philip the Arab and his subsequent defeat, and the defeat and humiliating capture of Valerian, who was kept in chains. By far the most important shift which explains why the Western Roman Empire fell was the growth in strength of Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Of course, the Roman view that barbarians were incapable of rational thought was not accurate. A Goth of Greek descent called Ulfilas contributed to the Arian controversy when he converted the Bible into Gothic. This illustrates how barbarian tribes such as the Goths could have impact on internal Roman politics during the late empire. The Germanic tribes bordering Rome now enjoyed reciprocal relations. The barbarians often provided manpower and benefited from the prosperous trade gained from bordering the empire. They had transformed from unintelligible to unequal partners or client states. This transformation was made possible by growth in population and sophistication of their tribes. The balance of power between Rome and barbarian was always precarious. While Rome generally held dominance, this dominance was not unsaleable. Archaeological evidence from sites across Germania suggests that the 4th century was a time of significant agricultural, economic, social, and political developments. Larger settlements which included production of more specialized items began to form. Germanic societies began to become more complex and more powerful political leadership became possible, partly based on Roman gifts and payments. The extent of this change can be seen by comparing the descriptions of Cassius Dio in the 2nd century with a 4th century source. In the 2nd century, Pannonia was described: the Pannonians lead the most miserable existence of all mankind, for they are not well off as regards either soil or climate. By the 4th century, however, the region of Pannonia, a land rich in everything, not only in crops and livestock, but also in business and slaves. Across the frontier regions there is evidence of an increased centralization, particularly among the borders of the imperial frontier. The Romans were aware of the danger of increasingly powerful barbarian kings and did much to prevent this. This policy was broadly successful when the internal political situation was stable. During periods of political instability, however, this policy could and was neglected. When the precarious balance of power noted earlier is remembered, this increase in strength of these tribes explains why the Roman state was overwhelmed by groups which previously had been so inferior to the Romans. In the 1st century, Germania was divided into small tribes which were so impoverished that the Romans decided it was not worth conquering. By the time the Huns arrived in the 4th century, they had developed new wealth and political structures. The seed and origin of all the ruin and various disasters that the wrath of Mars aroused, putting turmoil in all places, we have found to be this: the people of the Huns. As Ammianus describes, the catalyst which made this new threat a reality was the Huns. Rome had always previously been able to manage migration on their own terms and in a controlled manner, but this option was removed largely due to the arrival of the Huns. The arrival of the Huns therefore pushed enormous numbers of Germanic people into Rome's borders, including the Visigoths and likely the Vandals, Alans, and Suevi, and possibly Radagasius Goths. The external changes in the 4th century therefore best explain why the empire fell in 476. The Romans incorporated dominance over barbarian peoples as a fundamental part of their political structure. However, this dominance was never overwhelming and much of it was contingent on barbarian disunity. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty and the economic, social, and political developments of barbarian tribes in Germania threatened this balance of power, which required careful management by Rome. The arrival of the Huns made this situation unmanageable and forced the migration of enormous numbers of people inside the empire. The great paradox of the fall of Rome is that neither barbarian nor Roman wanted the empire to stop existing. No great barbarian conspiracy smelled blood and decided Rome was weak enough to conquest. Instead, most barbarians were pushed into the empire and then exploited times of internal chaos at the center of Rome to advance their own interests. The change of the balance of power, which caused the collapse of the empire in the West, therefore is best explained by the growing strength and cohesion of Germanic groups and not by the enfeeblement of the Roman Empire. We have no way of knowing the number of warriors that these migrating groups could field, but estimates are 80 to 120,000. The most important effect of the Huns was to force this enormous number of Germanic warriors to act broadly in the same way against the interests of the empire.